afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. How many of you were here yesterday? How many of you loved it yesterday? So we have more in store for you today. My name is Donna Hill. I am the Executive Director for the Center for Black Literature here at Medgar Evers College, and we are thrilled to have you here with us today for our last day, but there's always something happening with the center, so make sure you stay in touch. Today's program, Climate Change, Restoration of the Planet, Voices from African American Diasporic Writers. That is our title today, and I want to introduce you to our moderator for this afternoon. Tremaine Lee is a Pulitzer Prize and Emmy Award-winning journalist, author, and MSNBC contributor. He is the host of Into America podcast, where he explores the intersection of race, power, and politics. For more than 2 decades, Tremaine has been at the forefront of America's defining stories, covering natural disasters, racial justice uprisings, and the ongoing struggle for true democracy and equality. He is widely credited as the first national journalist to report on the shooting of Trayvon Martin, and a story that helped ignite a nationwide movement. As a national correspondent at MSNBC, he led coverage of the killing of Michael Brown Jr. and the Ferguson uprising that followed, further cementing his role as a leading voice on race and justice in America. A contributing writer to the acclaimed The 1619 Project, he is also a Webby Award winner for his podcast series on Reconstruction's Unfulfilled Promises, a 4-time Signal Award winner, and a recipient of the prestigious Sigma Delta Chi Award for Blood on Black Wall Street, the legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre, his documentary on lingering impacts of the massacre 100 years later. His work has earned multiple NABJ salutes to excellence awards, 4 NAACP Image Award nominations, and recognition as Adweek's Podcast Host of the Year. In 2018, he won an Emmy for his reporting on gun violence in Chicago. Tremaine was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2006 as part of the Times-Picayune team covering Hurricane Katrina. A former fellow at New America and the Harvard Institute of Politics, he has been named to the Root 100 and Ebony Power 100 list of the most influential African Americans. He's previously reported for the Philadelphia Tribune, the Trentonian, Huffington Post, and the New York Times. And best of all, he is now an author with 1,000 Ways to Die, his first book. Please welcome our moderator, Tremaine Lee. Mr. Lee is joined by the following panelists: Sibo Campbell, a writer, director, cultural storyteller whose work moves across books, film, and design. His debut novel, Sky Full of Elephants, became a bestseller and is now being adapted for film in collaboration with Lawrence Fishburne's Cinema Gypsy Productions. Sky Full of Elephants has been longlisted for the Aspen Literary Prize, longlisted for the Mark Twain Literary Award, and shortlisted for Crooks Corner Prize. Campbell's forthcoming novel, Wells Without Water, sold in a major deal, also with Simon & Schuster, and continues his commitment to stories that challenge, haunt, and expand how we see our lives. Campbell's projects span original screenplays such as Sweet American Boy and Qualities of Soil, a short film anthology he intends to direct himself. His work has been described as cinematic and visionary, blending Southern Gothic atmospheres with speculative imagination and deep commitment to cultural memory. He is also the founder of Unother, a studio and cultural movement dedicated to authored storytelling across literature, film, events, and physical spaces. At its heart, Unother is Campbell's vision of what cultural brand cannot be inherited but authored with intention. So please welcome Mr. Campbell. And he is joined by Dr. Chelsea Mackay Frazier, a Black feminist eco-critic writing, researching, and teaching at the intersection of Black feminist theory and environmental thought. Across all her platforms, her work is dedicated to imagining harmonious worlds that refuse to harm Black people, the destruction of the environment, and the exploitation of femininity. She is the founder of Ask an Amazon, an educational consulting platform that supports students, professionals, organizations in crafting meaningful intellectual and creative legacies. She is also an assistant professor in the Department of Literatures and English at Cornell University. Dr. Frazier is currently at work on her first book manuscript, which consults Black women's art, activism, and storytelling to assemble Black feminist ecology, a creative approach and critical framework for understanding and reimagining our relationships to our environments. Her interdisciplinary research has been supported by numerous fellowships and awards. Please welcome Dr. Frazier. And rounding out our roundtable is Natalie Brazil, who holds an MA in Afro-American Studies from UCLA and is a graduate of Warren Wilson's College MFA program for writers. Her novel, Queen Sugar, was named one of San Francisco Chronicle's best books of 2014, nominated for an NAACP Image Award, and it was adapted for the long-running television series. Natalie has had residencies at the Ragdale Foundation, Virginia Center of the Arts, Hedgebrook, and the Residence Art Program, where she received the SF Film and the Bonnie Ratner Fellowship. Her nonfiction work has appeared in Lenny Letter, The Bitter Southerner, the Oprah Magazine, the Rumpus.net, and a number of anthologies. For 2 years, she was a writer in residence at St. Mary's College, where she taught a fiction workshop in the MFA program. Natalie is a member of the San Francisco Writers Grotto and lives in the Bay Area. Her nonfiction work includes We Are Each Other's Harvest, celebrating African American farmers, land, and legacy. Her upcoming novel, Friends and Family, will be released later this year. Please welcome Natalie Brazil. And now I will turn it over to our moderator, Mr. Lee.
Thank you very much. Let's give it up for y'all for making it today. I normally like to say y'all could be anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, but there's nowhere else you want to be on a Saturday morning like this than right where you are. So thank y'all again. To our esteemed panel, thank y'all for joining us. I look forward to this conversation. I think when we think of the environment, right, and climate change, it can sometimes feel heady, nuanced, or complicated, sometimes out of reach. But for Black folks in particular, we've been grappling with what it means to have a relationship with the environment and climate in the past, the present, and we'll have one in the future. And I wonder, in your respective works of scholarship and narrative storytelling, how you guys are making sense of or putting shape to our relationship to the environment. And anyone can start first. Ladies first, Natalie.
Well, I'll start by saying that first, living in San Francisco, I really feel like my own personal experience of climate change is evident every day. We just experienced 80 and 90 degree temperatures at a time of year where it's normally 50 degrees. So that was a reminder, even as recently as last week, of how the planet is changing. When I think about how Black people have had to deal with this, I think about what's happening along the southern coast, how a region that I love to write about, Louisiana, is under constant assault from climate change. The erosion of the coastal waterways is something that I know is affecting Black populations as we speak, and it's alarming. I think in Louisiana they lose the equivalent of a football field a day to the erosion along the coast, and it's alarming to think about the communities that are there, Black people, indigenous people, and how their homes are constantly under threat. So that's the first thing that comes to mind to me, is how those coastal communities are looking at displacement. I have not heard anything about any kind of governmental support for those communities. And I think that a lot of those communities will be left to fend for themselves.
Thank you. Dr. Frazier?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think when I started this work, I was entering into the field of eco-criticism. I'm coming from this scholarly background, and eco-criticism, at least when I encountered it, was very focused on the kinds of principles and ideas that emerge from a very white and masculinist understanding of the environment and relationship with the environment, you know? And so you have folks who are talking about how good it feels to go to their, you know, their lake house, or to go on certain kinds of hikes. And I'm not saying that Black people don't own lake houses or go on hikes. However, it's a very, very, even when we do, it's a very specific relationship to land, especially in this country where at one point we were legally considered property. And so what I wanted to do was think about, or what I needed in order to enter that field that I felt very convicted by and called to, given that I am someone who is loved by the earth and that loves the earth. I needed a different entry point. And for me, I think part of the reason why it was not as obvious to me is because it just felt so regular that my environmental teachers were Black women. My mothers, my aunts, my cousins, spiritual leaders, and also many people that I found in the literature. And so because that felt so normal, and because that that felt like an ethic that I wanted to not only prop up but also protect, it felt very right to think through the ways that the very, very specific methods that Black women use in order to help us to conceptualize our environments from the time of, you know, being children through old age, and also to derive solutions for ecological imbalance. So for me, it was about taking a field that was sometimes unknowingly, and maybe sometimes knowingly, excluding me, and thinking about what could be made from what felt like an exclusion. Like, maybe there is a different grammar to the way that Black women do things, and I'm interested in tracing that, naming that, putting that on a stage, and also protecting it. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Sipo.
Thanks, Jermaine. This is quite a personal question for me, I think. I've come at this from an angle that is narrative first, which is to say, I feel quite powerless in opposition to those forces, right? I sit back and I think the lands that I grew up on are being infringed upon in so many different directions at the same time. And I see very incremental changes that are coming through in the law. I see very incremental changes in the conversation. And I look at it and I go, it requires quite radical change. The increments won't achieve what we're trying to achieve because the pressure is greater than the increments. And so I look at that and I go, what power do I have as an individual to have any impact on that at all? And I sit in the sort of the silence, sort of sadness of that. And as a writing into fiction as a way to try to attack it, I often sit and I go, I can't use words to affect this, but could I use imagination? Can I create a world that people can see and go, if we aim towards this, the incremental changes will arc us towards something that will have impact on this. I grew up in a very small town. I grew up in a town, as you know, in the South where my mother had 10 children. She had 13 brothers. My mother had 13 brothers and sisters as well, so it was cousins for days at my grandmother's house. And she would not let us in. She would say, you have to stay outside and, you know, eat the pears off the trees, eat the pecans. We were on the land all day long. We made up our games on the land. My grandfather he did stucco, and so he would take sand and make a cement and quite literally paint cement on the exterior of buildings. So there's really personal and familiar relationship with the sort of toil that's required to maintain and to use the land to both benefit you and you to benefit it. At the same time, where I live, just across the bridge was the beach, and there are condos being constructed that block the pathways to even see it. And I tell this story often because it influenced so much that went into the work that I made. Is that I remember being 9 years old, and I remember what it felt like to see the ocean for the first time. And where I lived, we lived further away from the beach, but my mother wouldn't let us go because I had a cousin who drowned in an undertow. And one day, a bunch of us, we decided to just sneak away as you do, and we went to go see it. And we had to wander through our neighborhood, cross MLK, and then as you crossed it, the streets began to change. You know, you would get the lanterns and the sort of well-tended grass. And then there was a row of houses that blocked the view, and you had to jump one of the fences in order to get access to the beach. And what I remember is that it was the first time when I saw the beach, my knees were weak because I'd never seen the horizon, you know. And I really want you guys to understand what I'm saying. I could see as far as I could see. And that was the first time I'd ever felt that. And the people in those houses saw it every morning. It was their normal to wake up and experience all possibility. And in so doing, I think it translated to me feeling powerless and them feeling powerful. And so I was like, okay, we have to shift the imagination. Because if we can imagine something different, we can actualize something different. And I think I'm sitting in the space of going, we need radical change in order to affect it. And I experienced that in my writing. I experienced that in my everyday life.
Wow. I think in that response and what I've heard from each of you, that there's a broader definition of the environment. And I think about the literal pouring of ourselves into the land via our work and our emotion, or literally our sweat and literally our blood. How do we expand this idea of the environment beyond just forests and trees and something that's closer to the way that we've experienced and indigenous people have experienced it? Dr. Fraser?
Okay. Yes. So I think one way to think about it is to acknowledge the fact that thinking about ourselves, and by ourselves I'm referring specifically to African people, and for me that is African people means African descended, means black, so that's that. Okay? But we need to understand and remind ourselves that thinking about the environment as something outside of ourselves is a Euro-colonial invention. There is no word in most West African dialects for nature. Nature is the idea of us being abstracted from an ocean, abstracted from a tree, abstracted from the air, abstracted from a storm, abstracted from the river, abstracted from each other. And it does not make any good sense. And so one way, I think that's part of the reason why, in addition to our stories, right, that are found in our record of art, our Black cultural productions, right, we have this alternative understanding of ourselves in relationship to the environment. Various elements of the environment or various entities in the environment become kin, become cousins, become big sis, become, and it's particularly mother. And so, and also just twin versions of ourselves sometimes. And so if we actually take that seriously and then do some more of the work of recovering a lot of our indigenous practices, then that abstraction begins to dissipate. And to your point about radically addressing this very big problem, I think about this so much. And for me, a lot of what has soothed me, and I think part of the reason why environmentalism, as it descends from this Euro-colonial formation, always felt very confusing to me, is because, yes, looking at this sort of like large thing, there's another scholar who refers to sort of like planetary happenings as hyperobjects, to kind of bastardize his concept a bit. But to think about it that way is quite overwhelming, you know. But when I go to the river and I think about and meditate on the vibration of Oshun or Yemonja, that's a very different relationship, where I can engage with the largeness of a planetary figure while also knowing that that planetary figure gave me just enough water for me, you know? And it's my job and my honor and my joy to do with this water what I will, you know? That's my gift. And so that's part of, I believe, how our ancestors made that relationship accessible to us as humans. And I have seen that pattern recur in a tradition of Black cultural work. And it is what, again, I hope to continue centering so that we can move away from thinking that the environment is the environment, right, is the only way to make sense of our relationship to space. It is one way, and it is occasionally helpful, but it's not the only story.
Well, I think I love what you're saying, and I deeply appreciate that. And I also think that we have to shift the way we think about our connection to the land. And we have to acknowledge that for very legitimate reasons, there is a narrative in our community about what being connected to the land has meant. And I think that when we look historically since emancipation, our definition of success has often meant to move away from the land, right? Success, I mean, I'm a product of that. My dad left Louisiana and came out to California. My mother's people left South Carolina and Georgia and moved up to Detroit in order to make progress, get jobs in the Ford factory or out west in the, and I think over time, our definition of being connected to the land has meant failure, has meant not wanting to succeed. Success has meant coming to places like New York. And I think that that legacy, that narrative legacy, has really crippled us in a lot of ways, because unless we come from families who are still connected to the South, who've had the experience, as Sibo's family has, of growing up picking, pears off of trees and understanding that connection, I think that a lot of people have been disenfranchised for totally legitimate reasons. And until we shift the narrative about what success means, what farming means, what agriculture means, it's going to be very hard for us to get back to a place where we feel agency in order to be able to reclaim the legacy that has always been part of our heritage. It's always been part of our traditions, but that chain has been broken.
When I hear you speak those words in particular, I can't help but think of dispossession.
Absolutely.
And the violence baked into a dispossession, a ripping from the land, a ripping from what fed us and poured into us. And Sibo, when I think of you as a child seeing those buildings, there's violence baked into that. And I wonder, from those experiences and your work, are you trying to create a balm in restoring some sort of connection or understanding of that environment, if that's the right word?
I think so. I mean, for those that don't know, in my book, every white person in America walks in the ocean and drowns. And she's
a novel idea. She's like, I like that.
She said, I love that. Me too. And I'm often hit with the question, actually Jason Reynolds asked me this. He said, why didn't you give us restitution? Why didn't you give us violence back in return? And it was an interesting question. I don't know if I handled it appropriately, but what came out was that I feel as though we are so often put in the position of defending things with the weapons that are being provided to us to defend with, right? So the law moves us out of land, and all you can do is use the law to get it back. And that is an extraordinarily difficult position to be in. You have no agency in that. And I love listening to both of you speak because I feel myself illuminating just hearing you talk about these things, because it is a shift in the value system. I grew up, I'm going to give you a small example that will likely merge these two concepts. I remember my mother talking to me about the five senses, right? And she said, you have these five senses, and that's how you interface with your reality. If you can smell it, you can taste it, you can touch it, you can see it, that makes it real. But your grandmother, she had intuition, and that was a sense. She could tell somebody was pregnant from a mile away. She could smell it. And she goes, if that's true, then what now is your reality? How does it shift? How does it change? I used to live right up the street. I used to live on Parkside, not far from here. I used to walk past this every day. And when I moved to New York, in the experience that you're describing, I was like, where are the trees? Right? At what point can I be barefoot and not feel really gross, right, in this city? At what point can I put my hand in the sand and not come up with glass? And if I can't, my kids can't. And so it has to be a shift in the value system. And where I grew up, violence could not use violence against the violence that was imposed against me. I had to use something else. And that exploration of what that else meant actually stepping away from those systems entirely. And this is why I love what you say. To sit at the river and listen to the vibration is what it means to be wealthy. That's a definition of it. In fact, I work with some of the top hotels in the world. I can tell you, as a matter of fact, that what they think of as luxury is the return of time and nature. They will say, we'll take care of everything, don't worry about it, you get all your time back, and then they'll sit you on a beach. You already have that. It's just a reorientation of the value system and finding new tools to protect those things that you own. And it shouldn't mean that you, in order to stop the murderer, must become one. You have to be something else. And I think the exploration is simultaneously reimagining that center, as you said, and in so doing, redefining the values.
How have we arrived at this place, incorporating everything you just said there, that some of us have fled or been run off of the land in search of this other ideal of success, despite the fact that we gave everything to this soil? The fact that that nature seems to be the domain of this inclusive liberalism that's open for everyone, but we've still been disconnected. How have we fought and pushed to include ourselves back from whence we came into that land? And you've talked about this idea of imagination, Bernard imagination, and you talked about this idea of this false inclusivity. How are we grappling with that?
Well, I have a gripe with liberalism. And it's because here's one way I like to think about it. If, for example, let's say I'm an economist, and I'm like, there's a wealth gap, and black women are near the bottom. And, they're beneath in terms of maybe earning. White women, black men, and white men. Okay, well, let's come up with let's think about 5 wealth indicators and come up with programs and policies in order to address them for black women. But then liberalism comes in and says, ho, that's not fair. It can't just be for one group because that's discriminatory, despite the fact that the system that produced those conditions is discriminatory. But we're not going to talk about that.
Let's talk about it.
No, I'm just saying, this is how the logic goes, right? We don't want to talk about that, or the numbers. We're just going to talk about the fact that that is unfair, and so the solution often becomes, okay, no problem. We will create these programs, and then they'll be open for everybody, and black women they'll get some of it as well, and sometimes they do. Guess who else does? Everybody else, and that gap remains the same. Even though black women have more, right? And so for me, when I think about an environmental ethic, more often than not, it follows that same kind of logic, and the specificities of what black and feminine subjects, black women, need become subsumed under these broader needs of everyone, because as it goes, this is something that affects us all. We can't be splitting hairs worrying about individual groups. And it's like, well, hold on a second. If part of the reason why we're in this ecological situation in the first place is because of the exploitation of femininity and the extraction of labor from African people, then how could we not address those two things? Because it's those values that got us in this ecological situation in the first place. So how do we not account for the specificity of attending to the needs of the ecological needs of these demographics? And how do we not do that and then claim that we are making any type of meaningful or radical movement toward ecological harmony? That just, for me, makes no conceptual sense. And so when it comes to a lot of my inquiries started with inclusion, right? I was like, yeah, how would environmentalism be enhanced or enriched if there was a more sort of like understanding of inclusivity and Black women were included in this canon that eco-criticism is pushing, and that was my inquiry. And then I was like, you know what? I don't know if I care about that. I don't know if I care about that. Now, there are some very pragmatic legislative reasons why one should care about policy. So I'm not suggesting that we should completely turn away from those methods. But to your point, they can't be the only method. And there are some things that legislative action, liberal reform, formal notions of the political cannot account for, because they never did when it comes to African descended people, African indigenous people, our values, what we understand to be wealth, what we understand to be community, what we understand to be harmoniality. And so for me, and for us to overinvest in a liberal politics, no matter what shape it takes, maybe it's environmentalism, maybe it's something else, is to our detriment. But when it comes to environmentalism specifically, what that means is when everyone gets included, given the historical and cultural record, that means that Black women will be tended to last, if ever.
Natalie, we're thinking about that idea of mending this relationship with specificity for us.
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Mending this disconnection from the land. She's talking about this idea that it can't be, put to shape by just liberalism. Right. There has to be other things happening here. What do you think about that idea?
Well, an example that comes to mind for me, and you may know these folks up in upstate New York, I look at the work that Leah Penniman has done at Soulfire Farm.
Yes.
As a model of how to be strategic, to have a bigger vision for what is possible for Black people. Now she's a little bit more inclusive because she does include indigenous people, people of color. But if you don't know her work, Leah Penniman, her sister Naima, and they founded Soulfire Farm, which is about 80 acres of land that Leah and her husband acquired maybe 15 years ago now. And in addition to actually farming that land, they have now made that into a training center for young Black and brown people who aspire to farm. And I believe that when I was up there interviewing them for my nonfiction book, at that time, and this was probably 2018, 19, they had trained about 10,000 farmers who had then spread out and taken their practices, and their practices are indigenous. A lot of the things that they teach about how to farm, how to be in connection to the land, really are looking back at practices that have been part of our communities for generations. And now they have made another turn where they have been so successful in their teaching, in the models that they have created, that they now have given that I don't remember exactly what the structure is of their farm, but basically Leah and Naima have now stepped back and they have made it into a co-op. So there is actual ownership by the people who are working the land. And it's a model that has allowed them to then pass this on to another generation. So to me, that is a very concrete example of how to leverage all of their power, their strategy, into a model that will succeed for generations. And every time I think about, the work that they're doing, they really are the poster children for what they call the returning generation, right? People who want to go back to the land, but who need concrete skills, specific information about how to do that. Because you can have the dream, but unless you have real specific training, you are going to fail, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the financial piece is very real, because when it comes to, again, just thinking about the tools available to us and the weapons available to us and the protection and the shields available to us, more often than not, money, which can be all three, is something that is not in abundance when it comes to Black communities. And there's a relationship between money and resource management. And so, while ownership in, again, that sort of like abstract Euro-colonial sense might be antithetical to what we, our practices as Africans, it's also something that's necessary in order to steward and be in relationship with the land in certain in the ways that we would like to be, right? And so, and this is also part of the reason why, for me, indigenous, particularly African indigenous practices, even and especially for those in the diaspora, have never been in the past, and we should stop thinking about them as such, because many of them need to be recovered, extended, and evolved, right? There is no going back to a utopian African past, I don't think that that's useful, but it is very, very useful in order for us to think through what our ancestors did and then build on that. That's kind of the point.
Completely agree with both of you. Have you heard the term, and I'm sure you all have, I'm going to ask the audience, have you guys heard the term phototropic and gravitropic? Someone said this to me. I didn't know it. Someone said it to me. I'll be honest. But it's the idea that, right, it's the idea that a tree grows towards light and its leaves are photosynthesizing light and makes it phototropic. But it's also growing down deep into the earth, and it's drawing energy and it's drawing it from the gravity, so it's gravitropic. And I think about that often when I'm just wandering about. I live in near a forest. We moved from Brooklyn to London purely just to be closer to nature, and we live right on the forest. And I think about that every time I'm walking through the forest, because I believe that in my day-to-day life, but I believe it as a philosophy that we must both be excavating our past and creating a pathway to the future. We must both be phototropic and gravitropic. And so I align with what both of you are saying. In fact, what you just said gave me so much joy to hear about SoFi Farm. I never heard of it before. And I think there's an opportunity to do two things. One is to create a sort of a broader collective about all these people who are doing different things. They are often disconnected, and disconnection has been the primary weapon of both our oppressors and I think the culture that tries to own things. It will divide everything up. And so it's divided the fact that we have people doing things like this, and they should be connected to people doing it all over the country and all over the diaspora. The conversation can expand to the larger diasporic engagement, global diasporic engagement, and in so doing, you learn what they're doing in Haiti, you learn what they're doing in Sierra Leone, and you connect all those things. Technologically, you connect spiritually, you connect ecologically, and when you're doing that, businesses, practices, you learn what was done well before, and you find a way to bring it to the now, and you bring it into the future. I say this often in talks that I give because I think it's important that we reset every day that you walk around, you're living in someone else's imagination. You would not have imagined this reality that we're in right now. There's no scenario by which you could have been sitting at home and going, I'm going to build a world in my head, and thought, yeah, it's going to contain these streets and it's going to contain these cars. It wouldn't be this way. And so if you sit down and you go, I want to imagine something completely different, and then if you have the dots to connect, to bring it to life, it will completely transform what you feel like is your power. This is fundamentally different from that idea of wealth. It's our wealth, which is community first. And in community, you learn, you grow, you develop. And as you develop, you build towards your imagination, not someone else's. And so we must both be phototropic and gravitropic, I think.
That's beautiful, brother. And that, yeah, give that up. And you read my mind on this idea of imagination, and that we've been existing in someone else's. And in our own imagination, we wouldn't decenter ourselves in the environment or elsewhere. But I wonder, how do you, it's one thing to have conversations like this where we're like wrestling and grappling and doing the thought exercises, but how in a real practical sense can we help see the growth of imagination, especially I think in the generations coming behind us? How do you think we could do that?
I'll tap in on that. You use the word strategy, and I think sometimes strategy is afforded a different definition because it's used in different, most often different contexts. But when I talk about imagining a thing, it will be a dream until you make actions and it's towards it, right? So if you say, this is something I tell my kids, I tell them you have to have a trade, which is to say you have to have something that no matter where you are in the world, you can get a job. I don't care what the trade is. You can, till the land. You can make coffees, whatever it is, you can get a job. You have to have a goal, and the goal should be something that is attainable within the range of your current state. So if you want to be a graduate or you want to be a doctor, you can walk this ladder and you will eventually climb this ladder and eventually achieve it. And then you have to have a dream, and the dream is something for which there is no map. It doesn't exist, and you have to create it. The way to create it is to align those three things, where your goal, your trade maps to your goal, and then the goal will somehow propel you to your dream. But you got to know what the dream is. It's like if I told you we're going to go west, but I never say L.A., you're going to end up in San Francisco, and we ain't going to know what's going on. And so the idea is you dream really big, as big as you can imagine, and then you create the strategic steps to make it something that you do every day as a practice, something that maps directly to a goal that you can create as a milestone, and then you work your way to it. Strategy, because without it, we will always be pipe dreaming and we won't be moving in the direction of our aspirations.
I'd love both of you to also touch on that idea.
Well, I do a lot of things, but the thing that takes up most of my time right now is being an English professor. And so, my clay is books. And books are a very useful tool for me to help my students build their imagination or recover the imagination that's been beat out of them by school and tests and the rat race to get to an Ivy League university. So then I get them again as freshmen, and I'm like, great, now we can think again, we can play again. You did it, you made it, you in the club. Now let's get to imagining things. And when it comes to books, novels in particular, novels have a way of getting you to think about something that you may have never thought before by reminding you of feelings that you have probably felt before, like over and over again. And so within my classroom space, where these containers of other people's imaginations, especially other Black people's imaginations, are held in high esteem, and there are very few places where that's the case. It gives them permission, encouragement. There's an implanted desire to take those dreams seriously and use them in order to figure out what resonates with them. What part of this world resonates? This semester, I'm teaching Intro to African American Literature, which is an impossible class to teach every time because you have to try to figure out how to, introduce students to this wide and deep field. But this semester, I wanted to focus on providing as many representations of the fullness of Black love, tenderness, and joy as I could, not without a discussion of or representations of that which makes Black life hard in the West, because that would be dishonest. But I was very clear that I didn't want them to only have one side of the story, because it perpetuates this idea that Blackness equals blight, Blackness equals struggle. You hear people say, you know, oh, I love my history so much because we're so resilient, which, yes, we are resilient, but that's not all we are. Sometimes we chillin'. A lot, and that's part of life too.
That sounds like a book title. Sometimes we chillin'.
Sometimes we chillin'.
I'm claiming that one. So
Full stop. You know, and that's also part of Black life. That's worth regarding, and a lot of our creativity emanates from that space as well. And so for me, the practice of helping others, especially young people, to regard their imagination in certain ways comes again with the art, and particularly with fiction.
Well, I certainly appreciate that too.
This is a good crowd for that, right?
Well, and I think that, you know, it's so important because I think about the things that inspire me to get into that dream state where you can even begin to imagine what might be possible. Mm-hmm. And I love when I can get to a place where I am just open, whether that's other books, whether that's film, whether that's art, whether that's poetry. And what I think is alarming to me is to see how our educational system has stripped opportunities for creativity. And if there's anything that I would hope, it's that the educators who are left can do the work that you're doing, can do the work that Donna Hill is doing, to make sure that Black students, while they're getting the degree, right, while they're there to get get whatever they need to be able to achieve in the world, in a very practical, pragmatic sense, are also reminded that that's not all there is, right? That we can take a little bit of time to expand our imaginations. I was a high school teacher for many years while I was working on Queen Sugar, and I had a lot of those students who knew how to ring the bell, knew how to get the A, right? And were so hyper-focused on getting that acceptance letter from the Ivy League school. And I used to have to tell them at the beginning of the semester, don't ask me about grades. You are here to experiment. You are here to explore. And it was stunning to me how few of them actually could even give themselves permission to be creative. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing on the other side of that threshold to encourage your students to allow themselves to be creative, to dream the big dream. Because I think that without that, they're all going to be just automatons.
I'll echo that sentiment. I've been trying to give people language for this. I had a friend of mine, he's an artist, and he talked about his art, and he's like, I have to go sell out. And I thought, no, brother, you need to go chop wood. Mm-hmm. And that is to say, you go in those woods, but you're coming back here. And so the idea is you have a whole different framework in which you live, and you go there to chop the wood and bring it back. And I think people are getting lost in those woods, and we have to give them a space to come back to, or at least give them a language to identify the space to come back to.
They think there's only the woods.
It's only the woods,
it's
apparently.
Only the woods.
But it's more to it. It's more to it. And so bring the wood back and keep yourself warm.
I like that. One thing I appreciate about all of your work is that it doesn't rest in this dystopian feeling, right? There is something positive, right? There's been so much taken and stolen and lost from whence we came, but there's things that remained, and we continue to be fueled by that. I'd love for each of you to talk about this idea of what we've been able to hold on to and how it still gives us life. I know you have done a lot of work with farmers who are still literally with their bare hands growing nutrients for us and raising animals to sustain our lives. So if you could each just talk about that idea, I'd love that.
Well, I think part of my mission, both in Queen Sugar and in We Are Each Other's Harvest, was to say to audiences, whether they were readers or viewers, this isn't just something that happened in the past. It's the reason why Naima and Leah Penniman are on the cover of the book. It's because I knew that it would be too easy for a reader to dismiss the story if there was a picture of a man on a plow, right,
Sure.
on the cover.
Yeah.
They would say to themselves, I know that story. I don't need to revisit that because A, that's nothing but pain and suffering, and B, I've heard it 1,000 times. Naima and Leah Penniman are fierce, beautiful, unapologetic Black women, and they are the future. And I wanted the cover of that book to signal that this journey is not over, that there are people who are still doing this work, right? And when I think about the power of creativity to be able to offer that hope, it doesn't have to be just, we can say more than we're resilient, right? There are other possibilities. There are new worlds to discover. And that's the thing that gives me joy. I don't know that I could even write a book that was all tragedy and suffering, because creatively, I cannot live in that space. I have to feel that there is hope for something bigger, for something better.
Yeah, I also just think about the fact that they're both tatted too. Like, I'm like, yes, like there's very specific visual things. Like, we're here and we're moving forward. But as far as dystopia goes, you know, and also just to kind of continue this conversation about past, present, and time, you know, time that we're thinking about, like, when you're thinking about indigenous people, whether they're indigenous to this land, whether they're indigenous to, you know, the African continent, dystopia is a Tuesday. You know, no matter how privileged you are. And in addition to the fact that dystopia is a Tuesday, so too, you know, and it is at work. So too are the culture keepers, most of whom have been Black women or African women. And if they ever stopped getting busy, we would all already be dead. You know, and so for me, it is about giving our attention to, as I'm talking about the culture keepers, my mother's calling me, as we, I called her in, I did. You know, as we're thinking about how we want to move forward, we have to think about where we're putting our attention. To your point about creating art from this place of only blight, that can be the truth. There can also be other truths, as there have always been. And so I want my students particularly, and also my contemporaries and my colleagues, to think about how we maintain those practices amidst unspeakable dispossession. How do we communicate to each other? What kinds of frequencies and forms actually reach more of us in those moments of emergency and also in those moments of peace? For example, like I think about music. Music transcends both, as a form of communication, transcends both joyful times and also tragic times in terms of our ability to communicate. How can we increase our literacies around those levels of communication? Those kinds of communication that, again, those culture keepers were using. How can we figure that out? And for me, that bridge has been Black feminist thought and the Black feminist creative and intellectual archive. Thinking about those figures, thinking about Octavia Butler, thinking about, first and foremost, Zora Neale Hurston, who is the progenitor of Black studies. I don't care what nobody say. You know, thinking about Audre Lorde, thinking about Morrison, thinking, and so on and so forth, thinking about them as tuning agents. How do they help us keep our ability to listen to those transcendent forms of communication that have steadied us in times of tragedy and also in times of joy?
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. I think, one, you asked about dystopia. I love dystopian films. I love dystopian books. And almost every single one of them, there are no black people in them. It's fascinating. Like one of the ones I love is Mad Max, if you remember this. And in Mad Max, there's like the canopy of the sky is broken so the sun is pouring in, and somehow everyone gets whiter. And I'm like, that's not what the sun does. But the reason there are no black people in those dystopian films is because if we're there, it's not a dystopian. If we generate, right? This is the difference between scarcity and abundance. And I've been mapping this in my mind. It's sort of like a thing that lives in the back of my mind whenever I'm working on anything. And it's this idea that at a certain point, you go above the equator, and it gets very cold, and it's becomes suddenly very difficult to farm. There's no animals to hunt. You really start to gather closely into these caves, and you will develop a brutality in order to maintain that which is yours. You do whatever it takes to maintain that which is yours. And as you get closer to the equator, all of a sudden, there's plenty of food on the trees. There's plenty of animals. You're not concerned with your own survival. And instead of being in caves, you gather together. Instead of worrying about if you're going to have enough for tomorrow, you look up at the stars and you find poetry in them. You develop a whole other system of thinking. That's an abundance mindset. That mindset you still have. Every single one of you in this room, you still have it. You still have it. That's why we're plugged into, and everyone's tabbing us for the resource. The greatest resource America has ever generated is us. That's why they plugged into us. If there is a future and you are carrying something forward, it is the fact that you can generate anything you want whenever you want it. You can have it. The question is can you protect against people trying to exploit it? And we must figure this out. It's not our nature to act in that way. Our nature is to open the door and say, come in. And so how do you develop a sort of hybridization where you're able to go, you can't come in, but everybody else can, right? Muhammad Ali told us this story to a reporter where he said, if you're telling me there's 10,000 snakes at my door and 2 of them won't bite me, I'm not letting these snakes in. And so we have to protect the culture, I think, and know what the culture is so we can orient to it. And we can arrive to the table whenever we're in conversation with the same value system based off of that. You are an abundant people. You have been since the beginning, and you will be from here until the moon drops out of the sky. You will be. You can generate anything you want from nothing. You've shown it. This is what they call resilience. The other side of that is creative. Mm-hmm. And so carry that forward, but protect it, and honor it in such a way that it's sacred. It's not a resource for other people.
Wow.
Can I respond directly?
Yes.
To that? Because
and then we're going to come to questions after that.
Because thank you so much. And you touched on something, and this is part of the reason why I think about femininity conceptually the way that I do. When I am operationalizing Black feminism, it is sometimes people hear, oh, she's only talking about Black women, which would only be part of the story. When it comes to Black indigenous epistemologies, a regard for femininity was standard because of the recognition of feminine people as creative.
Center of all abundance.
Right. And so there is not, and so focusing on the stability of women in the community, focusing on the stability of developing practices around femininity, which look very, very different and have a very different meaning than what we understand as Western forms of gender, right? So that inclusivity that people are concerned about is like, it's already taken care of. You take care of the women, you take care of the community. That's just what it is. And there is a way that I'm hoping we can move forward by centering that. And one of the ways is for Black feminine people to be aggressively self-interested, which is very antithetical to a lot of environmental prescriptions, which tell Black women who have been, again, historically extracted from and told that their talent, if they're told that they're talented and that they are useful, that those talents and those values are always for somebody else. Always, like, oh yeah, you have it, but it's supposed to go over there, right? And then we sometimes are like, yeah, I'm talented and it's going over there. Like we protect that. We got to stop. That has to be stopped, because being aggressively self-interested when you have a different value system and you understand the importance of yourself in relationship to community, you know that you cannot afford to abandon yourself, because that means abandoning your community, right? Abandoning yourself for your community, you're a part of it. Again, it goes back to that abstraction principle. If we're abstracted from each other, we're ultimately abstracted from ourselves. We cannot build the kinds of relationships with other humans, other entities, nature, without that firmly being in place, especially if we're taking those alternative value systems seriously as African descended people.
If you read anything when you leave this room, go pick up the Combahee River Statement. It identifies it. It's the greatest thing I've ever read. It identifies exactly what she's talking about, and it essentially says that when you do center Black women, it elevates everyone, and you must.
Every time.
It's called the Combahee River Statement. I'm pronouncing this correctly.
Yep,
yes.
the Combahee River Collective Statement. Yes. You can find it all over the internet. Get on the Googles.
And it's crazy because it's not in any school that I've ever been in. Someone had to hand me that. No, I'd never seen it before, and someone handed it to me 2 years ago, and I was like, where did this come from? And it should be taught in schools.
Well, tenure track Black feminist professors are few and far between for a lot of the reasons that we're talking about.
Well, listen, y'all. First of all, my spirit and my soul the embers are burning. But I'm not going to hog up the microphone and ask all the questions. I'd love to turn to you guys in the audience. If you have any questions, you can either come to this mic, or I think we might have someone to bring you the mic. If you just raise your hand, that'd be great.
Combahee. I think it's spelled Combha. I did not win the spelling bees, so pardon me.
Yeah, any questions, just raise your hand and someone will bring you the mic. Or you can come to this mic here. All right, we have a question over here in the corner by the window. If we can get a mic to her. There we go. Thank you very much, brother. Appreciate you.
I really appreciate this panel, and I'm very happy to see you. I appreciate your work that you've done. You've done a tremendous amount of work.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Thank you.
I wanted to share a very quick story and give a suggestion. I was born in Cotonou, Dahomey, which is now called Benin. And our culture is matrilineal, but it is also based on agriculture. That is the foundation of our culture. So we are connected by these agrarian societies and the products that we produce. One of the things that I wanted to share was, it was something that was really humbling for me. I was here in school, and I learned something called the nitrogen cycle. And so I thought, oh. And then afterwards I went home and I thought about it. We did the nitrogen cycle, but I didn't know that that's what it was. There's a point in time, because I was very young at this point, so I'm not sure the month of the year, but it is about 3 months before the planting season, when all the women and the men make these nets, like the fisher nets, and they go to the rivers, and they throw these nets in the water, and they scrape out all of the dead fish, and the men, not the women, which is interesting because it's a matrilineal society. The men plow the earth, they upend the earth, and they put all of those things from the river, the leaves and the dead fish, and then they cover that. That land then is left to compost. It's like composting.
Decompose.
So that it can be two different ones. If it's its old family land, sometimes it can be 3 or 4 planting seasons, and sometimes it can be one. But they cover it with earth, and they don't do it until the farmer, I don't know how to translate, but the person who controls and dictates where you will plant this or where you will plant that. I don't know if you have similar kinds of societies here in the diaspora. But so I thought, my God, we did the nitrogen cycle, and my grandmother, my aunts, my cousins, all of us, we used to say, oh my God, let's run when that time came, because it was such a tremendously odorous situation. But that land was left to hibernate, to germinate, and then that was what you call humus, the very the very black soil. It was fertilizing. So we never use fertilizing. I think similar situations like that occur throughout Africa. So that's why we don't have a lot of the pollution from the fertilization, because it allowed nature to run its course, and then the Dokweja was the one who determined whether or not this soil was now ready for this particular planting, and this was ready for that. So yams, different kinds of yams, grew at different times. So we almost always had food. I'm just saying that, years later, here's this child from this grandmother who did all these things, who never went to school, who was, quote, illiterate, very intelligent, sciences. And then I learned a word called nitrogen cycle, and I had no relationship to nitrogen cycle, but I had relationship to this ceremony, I guess you'd call it, that we did every year that I never really thought about. So I just wanted to give that story. And the suggestion that I would like to make is that I said it yesterday, and I'm saying it again today. We really need to think about what our children are reading and what we read to them. And I would encourage us all not to go on Google, but to take some names like Virginia Hamilton, like Eloise Greenfield. Do not go on Google, go to a bookstore and ask them to buy those books, because we have gotten away from a lot of the books that we were reading in the 60s and the late 50s, when the Council on Interracial Books was challenging the educational system about the kinds of images, literary and visual, that they were giving not just to our children, but to white children as well, so that we could then accept John Keats's book as as answering the needs of African American children when it wasn't. That's my suggestion. That's
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Some of these things we have never forgotten, right? They've gotten further away, but we've never forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic panel. Loved everything, loved everyone. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing, my Amazon sister. So, Cabo, that book, Sky Full of Elephant, okay? Everyone died in the beginning. Now, what made you come up with that idea, and why did you let it end like that? I almost feel like I'm unfulfilled, like there was something else supposed to happen. And I understand the imaginative part of it, and that you want people to probably kind of imagine based on the journey of this biracial child and her family and everything like that. But why did you let it end like that? And I don't want to spoil it unless you want to go ahead.
It's literally a spoiler. I don't know. No, if you look at does anyone have a copy of the book in here? Can you? Thank you. If you see the cover, it has like lightning bolts going into someone's head and then coming out. When I wrote this, I said, when they close this book, the book is the signal. It's the signal. And so if you sit with it and you go, what do I do next? That's what the book's function is. In terms of where it came from, the idea came from, it's I don't know if you've heard the story, Tremaine, but it draws a relationship to you. How many people here have seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off? That's where I based the whole book on. And so I was watching this movie one day here in New York, and it was winter. And I'm watching this white kid, right? He looks right at the camera. He has the audacity to look at the camera while he's talking. And then he skips school, and he gets his friend to skip school, and he changes grades. He impersonates a cop. He steals a Porsche, right? And at a certain point, he's in a parade, right, singing Donkashay. And we're rooting for his mischief. And as I'm watching it, just out of nowhere, I thought, what would happen if I took Ferris Bueller and I replaced him with Trayvon Martin? Same reaction I had, y'all, because we all know what would happen. And I thought, why can't I imagine that? Why can't I sit here and imagine Trayvon still in that Porsche and me rooting for him and us rooting for him in the same way? And I went back to Toni Morrison, as I do. And, you know, she often talked about writing beyond the gaze. And I thought, well, what happens if I remove that gaze entirely? Then will we imagine it? And it doesn't mean that the trauma goes away, but it gives us space to process it. And so over the course of the book, the hope is that people begin to process some of those emotions. And I don't want to wrap it up in a bow. I don't want people to close that book and feel resolved, because it isn't resolved. We still got work to do. And so that was the idea.
Peace and blessings. Thank you, panel. You're amazing. I just have a question around, Natalie, you mentioned kind of like the Great Migration and moving in so out in that way. And then also, Cabo, you mentioned with being phototropic. How do we interrupt the trauma that's connected with, like, there's this rejection of the sun, like, I don't want to get darker, and colorism, and how that drives people's disconnect from the land, or the trauma that still lives in our DNA around how we were treated on the land. How do we interrupt that?
That's a great question.
I mean, I'll tap in. There's nothing that we do, and I want to stress this because I think it is an imperative. We often live in a space of convenience where we associate convenience with a sort of standard of wealth or a standard of affluence. We have to be able to live in the complex. We've always lived in the complex. All of our spiritual deities are about duality and beyond, and so we have to be able to live in the complex, which is to say you have to both progress and be healing in the progression. You have to be doing the work to heal, which is, for me, and I think it's different for every person, and as it should be, but for me, part of it is being in community with people I don't know and listening to those stories. I've been on so many panels. Half of the time I'm on a panel just listening to people, to talk to them and then go, what's going on, what's happening? Like, give me their perspective and watch it illuminate you. I say to people often that our melanin is black in this world, but in all other worlds, it's light. And so you have to take in all the resources that you can so that you can illuminate and at the same time be progressing towards a vision that you have. And the vision should include all of the things that you've toiled through, that you've overcome, that you're translating to your kids, that you're using as a mechanism to guide the future. But if it doesn't have simultaneously an incremental progression and an absolutely absurdly radical idea at the same time, then it becomes really difficult to feel the success. It becomes really difficult to feel like anything is changing, and then it reinforces those feelings of trauma, I think. And so I remember when I was maybe 14, I said, I want to travel to, which is sitting here saying it out loud to you all is really strange. I said I wanted to go to Wisconsin, and I wanted to go to Wyoming. And I don't know why I wanted to go to Wyoming. I just wanted to go to Wyoming. And then I went to Wyoming. You know what I saw? I saw bison. I saw a herd of bison. And I'd never seen anything like this before. And one of the indigenous people there, because I happened to be there, said, you see it because it's sister to your land. And I was like, well, there you go. There you go. And so the ability to go out, see the world, tap into it, connect culturally, but always have that big idea, I think puts you in a position where you are healing yourself through small measures and I think aspiring for greater ones at the same time.
I don't know if I have an answer that's better than that, so.
Oh, let's go see some bison, y'all.
Hi, my name is Levi. I'm a student at Medgar Evers College, and thank you so much for everything you said. My question is, I'm from a town, Paterson, New Jersey, which was the first city ever founded as an industrial city in America. So it actually was built around environmental water because we had a Great Falls. So the energy that Alexander Hamilton thought that Paterson can generate came through the waterfalls. So we came from a city, I was born out of water, I lived on the other side of Bridge Street. So my question is, what responsibility do the African diasporic writers have in documenting environmental injustice in ways policy and media often fail to capture? Because like around a year ago, there was a water problem where the levees and the pipeline had became contaminated over 200 years old. So certain parts of Paterson didn't receive water, whereas the other parts of Paterson did. So it was like all over the news where my friends who's from Paterson was telling me they had no water, they had no clean running water for like months. And the other parts of Paterson was getting bottled water, but it was well, like I said, I grew up, we was on the other side of Bridge Street, which was considered down the hill. Up the hill where was our houses wasn't along the Passaic River. Back then, that was like the nice side of town. But now everything's changed, and now because Passaic River is considered a historical district because of the Great Falls, now the other side of town where the black community has been pushed into, when things happen, they don't get water supply for months. So the question is, how do we as black writers document what's going on in small towns such as Paterson, New Jersey, who don't have a radio station or a television station, and a lot of people may not know what's going on. So how do we share that as writers through gentrification? There's certain black communities that's being erased. How can we document what's going on in those towns? Because it happens in Michigan as well, you know, in different towns. So that's my question.
I'm not a fiction writer, but I will say, in terms of the way that I curate texts, I don't believe that it is the job of fiction writers to do like what journalists do, for example, right? I think that there can be overlap between those vocations, but I don't necessarily think that it is the responsibility of a writer to tell a story outside of the one that they want to tell. I do, however, think that it is important for black fiction writers to use their talents to tell our stories. And more often than not, when that and to tell our stories in a full and impactful way. And more often than not, when that happens, they're telling a story of environmental injustice. And so I think that because of what blackness signifies in the West, environmental injustice is baked into that. And so, and I also don't think that there's as much distance from fiction writers and everyone else as we would like to think. And so being a creative person that has an idea and has the time, space, and resources, or takes the time, space, and resources, can tell that story. I'm looking at you.
Yes, ma'am.
That's what I was thinking.
I'm just the point guard here, but I do think it is very important for all of us to harness our skills and take your weapon of choice and aim it at whatever is opposing us, but also to understand how we experience this country. I think it's critically important that we are the ones to put shape to it. Because we know the colors that mix the magenta with the red and the blue. We know how to put texture to our experiences, but also in a way that everyone never forgets. No one ever forgets who we are and where we are and what we've been through. So, long answer, long. I think it's critically important for us to do that. Any other questions? It's been a great group. Going once, going twice. Any? We have one more before we give it up. One more. Last question. You guys have been a great audience, so thank you very much for your smart, thoughtful questions.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists and our moderator. My name is Nashonda Millington. I'm a student here at Medgar Evers College. And for my question, how does one decolonize their mind around their future beyond the looming news of climate change as Black people, as Black women, and as diasporic peoples?
I'm going to make space, but I want to answer this only because I'm literally writing about this right now, and it's in my brain. She talked about could you repeat it just so I make sure
right.
I don't want to say it for you.
How does one decolonize their mind around the future beyond the looming news of climate change as Black diasporic peoples?
So the book that I just wrote, and when I came here, I was late because I was editing, trying to get it done. It explores this relationship. It's a horror book, but it explores a relationship between what we think of as demonic possession and colonization. This idea that something invades you and it makes you completely no longer who you are. I experienced this on Flatbush, right over here. I'm walking. I just saw do you remember when that new Exorcist movie had come out, and it was like they had the black girl in it, and you probably didn't see it. It was terrible. But when we think of demonic possessions, we think of this little innocent white girl who's like, lacerations, and she's like vomiting, all that. I'm over on Flatbush. I see this man, and he's homeless. His feet are bare and they're swollen and chalky, and he's got lacerations and boils on his skin, and his clothes are falling off. He can't control his bowel movements, and he's screaming at nothing. And I went, that looks like what I just saw in that movie. And then I looked around at the neighborhood where I was, and I said, the buildings are dilapidated. The roads are dilapidated. This looks like what I saw in that movie. So I asked myself, if we were literally possessed from a land we brought here, we're slowly losing who we were. And we are all in a state of possession right now. And the question is, how do you exercise that type of evil? And the only way is embodiment. The only way is to embody who you've always been. And that means the exploration of your history. That means the evocation of your ancestors. You got to be able to call them by name, right? It means understanding and reorienting your value system around us, not around something else. You cannot give up who you are. You have to fight against that invasion. And that invasion is happening on all sides at all times. And you have to fight against that invasion and hold the center of yourself.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear from y'all too on that one also.
Yeah, I'll just add. I too am writing a book about.
We need to sit down.
So Black Feminist Ecology is the name of my book, and what it names is this method and analytic to help us to tune into a very specific frequency that is only legible when Black women are at the middle of this ecological conversation, the center, when they occupy the center. When they occupy the center, what is forced is, or invited, demanded even, is a different value system. Because in the West, again, Black women are in a Western logic, there is no Black woman at the center. One of the things that I hope the book accomplishes is to give people a vantage point from which they can look at the world around them with a different set of eyes, but also to get very quiet so that we can tune into a very specific frequency that is lower than language, deeper than language, right? And that speaks to a lot of the different ways that we are in the world. Our cultural practices, our thoughts. You spoke to One of the chapters in the book is devoted to spirituality. And this is not about you believe this, I believe that. This is about thinking about indigenous spiritual systems as a philosophical or epistemological framework that organizes what we think is important and organizes who we are, and how valuable that can be as an antidote to that invasion, right? The colonial imposition and what that did to our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with the flora, our relationship with the fauna, our relationship with the water. It reorganized everything. It told us to understand melanin as something that is ideal requires a different value system. So what I would say is, what you can do is, I get this from my students. They're like, okay, what can we do? How do we, we getting rid of the straws? We getting rid of the plastic bags? What we doing? Like, give me some action, Dr. Fraser. And I'm like, go home and sit with yourself. Just start there. Just really, we have been so dispossessed from our ways of being that we have to go back to that childlike state so that we can build up those practices. And that first thing that we have to do is listening to ourselves, going to play like you did when you was a kid. When you were a kid and someone said, "What you doing?" You were like, "Well, there's a dinosaur right there and there's a bear right there and me and this tree are talking." And in your brain, that made plenty of sense. Those are the kinds of skills that we have to start from. You trusting that what you feel and see is real, because just because you imagined it doesn't mean it's not real. That's the first part of bringing something into fruition, a different thing. Where another person asked about beauty standards, where a beauty standard can change to accommodate you at the center, where a politics, an infrastructure of a society can change to accommodate you at the center. But first, you have to be at the center of yourself. So that's just the first place to start. The kinds of practice and guided, right? Like, I'm doing this for a very particular purpose, but also just everything tells Black women that we're not as important as we are. I want us to know that when it comes to building an ecological politic, AKA thinking about the relationship between everything, we first have to start with the relationship with ourselves.
The only thing I can really add to that is, I think about how much static and noise we have in our daily lives. And I would agree, you cannot get to a place of clarity if your mind is constantly bogged down with chatter, right? If you're always looking externally for validation, for ideas, for inspiration, that has to come from you. What you do with it, right, how that ends up expressing itself can take any number of forms. But and I say this as someone who often has to work to quiet my mind, right? And so the only thing I can really add to these words of wisdom is to try to disengage in order to find a quiet place where you can actually hear what you are thinking, to figure out how you are feeling. You'll never decolonize anything if you are constantly taking in all of the chatter and the noise. I think about this woman, her name is Karen Washington, and she's kind of the matriarch of urban farming here in New York. And she tells this story about how she even came to the idea of putting her hands in the soil. And she talks about how she was sitting in her apartment, she looked across the street, and there was this abandoned lot. And she decided, it was almost like she was divinely inspired. She decided that she was just going to clear out that lot and plant tomatoes. And she talks about what first of all, the sense of peace she had when she actually put her hands in the soil. So that's first. And I'm not saying you have to clear out a vacant lot. I'm saying, there are a lot of small ways that you can reconnect. You don't have to travel far to be able to re-engage with nature, right? And then she talks about the moment of revelation she had when she bit into that tomato that she had planted, right? And understanding what nature was supposed to be as opposed to all of the input and the stimulation that she had internalized about how she was even supposed to grow food. So I would say quiet your mind, and then I would say find a way to reconnect. It does not have to be a grand gesture, but I know that a lot of people have found peace and inspiration just from doing something very small and incremental.
Natalie, Dr. Frazier, Sibo, thank y'all very much. Let's give it up one more time for our panelists. A few housekeeping notes. Again, thank you all for joining us. The authors will be signing books right after, and the next session, Beyond Banned Books, will be right here in this room at 4 p.m. Thank y'all again for coming. Really appreciate it.
Okay. And also, please remember that part of what we're doing here is expanding and sharing knowledge as well as books. And so please go downstairs. You have 45 minutes or so to get your book signed by the authors who are here. Please engage with our vendors. Those are our small Black businesses from the community. Support them as well. And you can always support the Center for Black Literature as well by going to our website and donating. So please enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Be back here at 4 o'clock for Beyond Banned Books. Thank you.